At the inheritance meeting, everything felt decided before I even walked into the room. The conference table was already full, papers neatly arranged, glasses of water untouched, and my brother Marcus sitting at the head like he had always belonged there. The lawyer was mid-sentence when I entered, but Marcus didn't even wait for him to finish. He leaned forward with that same confident smile I had seen my entire life, the one that made people believe him before he even said anything, and said, "Let's be practical here. I've been managing the properties for years. It only makes sense they go to me." No hesitation, no discussion, just a conclusion delivered like it was already agreed upon. My mother nodded instantly, placing her hand gently on his shoulder as if sealing the decision with approval. "He's right," she said. "Marcus has done all the work." My aunt let out a quiet laugh, the kind that isn't meant to be loud but still cuts deep. "What would Tegan even do with rental properties?" she added, glancing at me like I was some distant guest rather than family. My father didn't laugh, but he didn't defend me either. He just looked down at the table, avoiding eye contact, as if silence was easier than choosing a side. And in that moment, I realized something very clearly. This wasn't a discussion. It was a performance, a decision that had been made long before I was invited. 11 properties, prime locations, Tampa, Orlando, Miami Beach, combined value over $4 million, passive income that most people only dream about, and they were giving all of it to Marcus like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Tegan doesn't need any of it," my mother continued, her voice soft but final. "She has a stable job, government work, she's comfortable." Comfortable. That word hit harder than anything else. Comfortable meant small, safe, forgettable. It meant I wasn't seen as someone who could build, grow, or succeed beyond the narrow version of me they had created in their minds years ago. Marcus leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like a king who had just secured his kingdom. "I mean, come on," he said, glancing around the room for validation. "Let's be honest. I've been running everything anyway. This is just making it official." Everyone nodded again. Of course they did. This was the story they had always believed. Marcus, the successful one, me, the afterthought. But what none of them noticed was that I wasn't reacting. I wasn't upset. I wasn't arguing. I was just sitting there, quietly observing exactly the way I always had. Because the truth is, this moment didn't surprise me. I had been waiting for it. Every dismissive comment, every assumption, every time they overlooked me, it had all been leading here. And I needed to see it happen. I needed to hear them say it out loud. Needed to know that even now, after everything, they still had no idea who I really was. The lawyer cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. "We should review the documentation before finalizing anything," he said carefully, but Marcus waved him off. "There's nothing to review," he replied. "We all know what Grandpa would have wanted." That sentence almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so completely wrong. My grandfather had known exactly what he was doing. Every decision, every move, every conversation we had over the years, it had all been intentional. But Marcus didn't know that. None of them did. I finally shifted in my chair, just slightly, enough for the movement to catch my father's attention. He looked at me for a brief second, almost uncertain, like something didn't feel right, but he couldn't figure out what. "Tegan," he said slowly, "you understand, right? This is just fair." Fair. Another word that people use when they don't want to question their own decisions. I held his gaze for a moment longer than usual, letting the silence stretch just enough to make him uncomfortable. Then I smiled. Not a big smile, not dramatic, just a small, controlled one. "Dad," I said quietly, my voice calm but steady, "you really don't know, do you?" The room changed instantly. It's hard to explain, but you could feel it, the shift. Conversations stopped. Chairs creaked. My brother straightened up, his expression tightening as if something had just moved outside his control. "No, what?" he asked sharply. There was irritation in his voice now, but also something else, something closer to unease. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence sit there, heavy, uncomfortable, forcing them to pay attention in a way they never had before. For the first time in that room, I wasn't invisible. I leaned back slightly, folding my hands in my lap, completely relaxed. Because the truth is, I had nothing to prove anymore. Not to them, not to anyone. And then I said it. Who actually owns those properties? For a second, no one moved. It was like the words didn't register, like their minds rejected the possibility before even considering it. My mother frowned, confused. My aunt looked annoyed. But my father went completely still. His face changed in a way I had never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, recognition, like something deep in his memory had just surfaced and he didn't want to believe it. Marcus let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "What are you talking about?" he said, but his confidence was already slipping. Just a little, barely noticeable, but I saw it. I had always been good at noticing things no one else did. I reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not dramatic, just calm, controlled. I pulled out my phone and placed it gently on the table. "Maybe we should check the records," I said, just to be sure. Now the tension was real, the kind that fills a room without anyone speaking. The lawyer hesitated for a moment before opening his laptop, clearly unsure why he was suddenly being pulled into something that felt far more complicated than a simple inheritance meeting. Marcus watched him closely, his jaw tightening. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "There's nothing to check." But the lawyer had already started typing. And that's when everything began to fall apart. Growing up, I learned very early that attention in our family wasn't something you earned. It was something you were born into. And Marcus had been born into it perfectly. He was 3 years older, louder, sharper with words, and most importantly, he knew how to make people feel impressed. At family gatherings, he was always in the center, talking about big dreams, future plans, and the kind of life he was going to build. People listened to him like he was already successful, even when he hadn't done anything yet. I, on the other hand, existed on the edges of those same rooms. Not ignored completely, but never truly seen either. I was the quiet one. The one who listened instead of spoke. The one who noticed things other people didn't care about. And over time, I stopped trying to compete for attention because I realized something important. People reveal more when they think you're not a threat. My mother would often say, "You need to be more confident, more like your brother." But what she didn't understand was that I wasn't lacking confidence. I just didn't need to prove it the way Marcus did. While he chased validation, I chased understanding. And that difference changed everything. Because while Marcus was busy building an image, I was building skills. While he talked about success, I quietly studied how it actually worked. And the only person who ever noticed that difference was my grandfather. He never treated me like I was less. He never compared me. Instead, he asked me questions. Real questions. About markets, about numbers, about why certain properties performed better than others. At first, I didn't realize how rare that was. But looking back, those conversations changed my entire life. Because for the first time, someone wasn't looking at who I appeared to be, they were looking at what I could become. And that's something Marcus never understood. He thought success came from being seen. I learned that real success comes from knowing things others don't, from seeing patterns others miss, from preparing quietly while everyone else is distracted. And over the years, that quiet preparation turned into something far more powerful than anyone in my family could have imagined. But the thing about being underestimated is that it creates a kind of invisibility. And invisibility, if you use it right, becomes an advantage. Because when no one is watching you closely, you have the freedom to build something real without interference, without expectations, without pressure. And that's exactly what I did. When my grandfather's health started declining, everything became clearer, not just for him, but for me as well. By then, I had spent years learning under him. Not just understanding how real estate worked, but understanding how people behaved around money. And what he saw in Marcus concerned him more than anyone else realized. Marcus didn't respect the system. He respected the outcome. He loved the idea of money, but not the responsibility that came with it. And my grandfather knew that was dangerous. One evening, he called me over, just the two of us. No family, no interruptions. Just a quiet conversation in his kitchen, the same place where he had taught me everything from rental yield to negotiation tactics. He didn't waste time with emotions or long explanations. He simply placed a folder in front of me. Inside were documents, legal, official, already prepared. "I'm transferring everything to you," he said. I remember staring at him, unsure if I had heard correctly. "All of it?" I asked. He nodded. 11 properties, every single one. Not as an inheritance to be fought over later, but as a direct transfer effective immediately. "I've been watching," he said calmly. "You don't talk about success, you build it, that's the difference." There was no dramatic moment, no emotional speech, just trust. Complete and undeniable trust. And in that moment, I understood something that changed everything. This wasn't just about money. It was about responsibility, about protecting something that had taken decades to build. The transfers were done legally, recorded officially, and finalized without anyone else knowing. That was intentional, because my grandfather didn't just want to give me the properties, he wanted to protect them. And part of that protection was allowing everyone else to continue believing what they always had. That Marcus was in control. That he was the one managing everything. And so, after my grandfather passed, nothing changed on the surface. Marcus stepped in confidently, taking over management just like everyone expected. He thought he was running the estate. He thought he was in charge, but the reality was very different. He wasn't managing his inheritance. He was managing my assets, and I let it happen. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to see what he would do when he believed no one was watching. And what he did told me everything. For the next 5 years, I lived what most people would call an ordinary life. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. I worked my government job, showed up to family dinners, listened to Marcus talk about his real estate success, and smiled when people underestimated me. But behind that simple image, something very different was happening. I was tracking everything, every rent payment, every expense, every decision Marcus made, because the moment he believed the properties were his behavior changed. He became careless, overconfident. And slowly that confidence turned into something else, greed. It started small. A little cash here, an unreported payment there. Nothing obvious enough to raise suspicion immediately. But patterns always reveal themselves over time, and I was patient. I documented everything, quietly, methodically, without confrontation, because this wasn't about catching him in one mistake. It was about understanding who he really was when he thought there were no consequences. And the truth was worse than I expected. He wasn't just managing poorly. He was stealing, consistently, repeatedly, over years. He manipulated reports, hid income, charged tenants unofficial fees, and slowly built a lifestyle that didn't match what he claimed to earn. New cars, expensive trips, luxury living. And everyone believed it came from his hard work. I watched all of it, not with anger, but with clarity, because every action he took was building something for me as well. Evidence, proof, a complete record of choices that would one day matter. And the most interesting part, he never once questioned it, never once thought to check ownership records, never once considered that the person he dismissed might actually be the one in control. That level of certainty, that blind confidence, was exactly what made him vulnerable. Because people who believe they can't be challenged stop protecting themselves, and eventually they expose everything, which is exactly what he did. Back in that meeting room, as the lawyer continued checking the records, the atmosphere had completely shifted. What started as a simple inheritance discussion had turned into something far more uncomfortable. Marcus was no longer relaxed. His posture had changed, his confidence cracking just slightly as uncertainty crept in. "This is pointless," he said, trying to regain control, but his voice didn't carry the same authority anymore. The lawyer finally stopped typing and looked up, his expression different now, serious, focused. "These properties," he began slowly, "are not listed under your grandfather's name." The room froze. My mother frowned. "What do you mean?" she asked. The lawyer turned the screen slightly so everyone could see. "They were transferred years ago, legally recorded." Marcus leaned forward quickly. "Transferred to who?" he demanded. That was the moment. The exact moment everything I had waited for came together. I stood up calmly, walked toward the screen, and looked at the records that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. "To me," I said quietly. No shouting, no anger, just truth. "They've been mine for years." Silence hit the room like a shockwave. My mother stepped back, confused. My father stared at the screen like he was trying to process something impossible. Marcus didn't move at all. His face went pale, his mind clearly trying to catch up to reality. "That's not possible," he said, but even he didn't believe it anymore. I turned toward him, meeting his eyes for the first time in that room with complete certainty. "Everything you've been managing," I continued, "every decision you've made, you weren't doing it for the estate." I paused just long enough for it to sink in. "You were doing it for me." What happened after that wasn't chaos, it was realization. The kind that doesn't explode immediately, but slowly spreads through a room until no one can ignore it anymore. My mother started asking questions, my aunt demanded explanations, my father remained silent, and Marcus finally understood the position he was in. Not as the owner, not as the decision-maker, but as someone who had been operating under a false belief for years. And more importantly, someone who had crossed a line he couldn't undo. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack him, I didn't need to, because the truth was already doing all the work. "For 5 years," I said calmly, "you had every opportunity to do things the right way." He didn't respond. "You could have managed responsibly, you could have been honest, you could have acted like someone who deserved trust." Still nothing, because deep down he knew this wasn't about a single mistake. This was about a pattern, a choice repeated over and over again, and choices have consequences. I gathered my things slowly, not rushing, not dramatic, just finished. Because that was the moment everything changed, not for them, but for me. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed to prove anything. I had built something real, quietly, patiently, without recognition. And in the end, the same silence they once used to dismiss me became the space where the truth finally spoke. As I walked out of that room, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel revenge. I felt clarity. Because success isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the one who understands exactly what's happening, even when no one else does. And sometimes, the strongest position you can hold is the one no one sees coming. The silence in that room didn't end when I walked out. It followed them. It settled into every corner of their understanding, breaking apart the version of reality they had believed for years. But for me, that moment wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because truth alone doesn't create consequences. Action does. And I had already prepared for that long before this meeting ever happened. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already in my hand. Not to check messages, not to process emotions, but to move forward with something I had been building quietly for years. I called my attorney. He picked up immediately. "It's done," I said. No explanation needed. He already knew what that meant. "Good," he replied. "Then we proceed." That same day, the documentation I had spent years compiling began to move through official channels. Financial records, transaction logs, tenant statements. Everything Marcus had done while believing he was untouchable was now being examined under a completely different light. Not as management errors, not as misunderstandings, but as deliberate actions tied to responsibility. And responsibility, when documented properly, turns into accountability within days. The situation began to shift in ways Marcus had never anticipated. What he once controlled was no longer in his hands. Calls he expected to go his way didn't. Conversations he thought he could dominate suddenly became careful, measured, distant. Because the moment uncertainty enters someone's reputation, everything changes. The confidence people once had in them begins to fade. And without that confidence, influence disappears. Marcus tried to reach me multiple times. Calls, messages, even showing up unannounced. But I didn't respond, not out of anger, but out of clarity. Because for 5 years he had every opportunity to act differently, every chance to stop, to question, to think beyond himself, and he never did. So now it wasn't my responsibility to guide him through the consequences of his own choices. Meanwhile, things around him started collapsing quietly. His professional life, which had been built on the image of competence, began to show cracks. People started asking questions, not loudly, not directly, but enough to create doubt. And doubt is powerful. It spreads faster than certainty ever can. The lifestyle he had built, the expensive habits, the confidence, the sense of control began to feel unstable. Because it had always been. It was just hidden under layers of assumption and belief. And now those layers were gone. But the most significant change wasn't external. It was internal. For the first time, Marcus wasn't in control of the narrative. He couldn't explain his way out of it. He couldn't charm his way through it. Because this wasn't about perception anymore. It was about facts. And facts don't respond to confidence. They respond to truth. My parents tried to reach out as well, but their tone had changed. It was no longer about convincing me to accept something. It was about understanding something they had never taken the time to question before. My father especially struggled with that shift. You could hear it in his voice when he finally called me days later. There was hesitation, not authority, not certainty, just uncertainty. "Tegan," he said slowly, like he was choosing every word carefully, "I think we need to talk." And for the first time in years, I realized something important. The dynamic had changed. Completely. This wasn't the same conversation we used to have. This wasn't a situation where I had to explain myself or defend my position. This was different, because now they were the ones trying to understand. And I was the one deciding whether I even wanted to explain. And that kind of shift doesn't happen often. But when it does, it changes everything. When I finally agreed to meet my father, it wasn't because I felt obligated. It was because I wanted clarity, not for him, but for myself. We met somewhere simple. No formal setting, no tension-filled environment like before. Just a quiet place where conversation didn't feel like a performance. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically, but in a way that comes from realizing something too late. For a few moments, he didn't say anything. And for once, I didn't fill the silence either. Because I had learned something over the years, silence reveals more than words ever can. Eventually, he spoke. "I didn't know," he said, not defensive. Not argumentative, just honest. And for a moment I believed him, because the truth is he didn't know, but not because the information wasn't there. It was because he never looked, he never questioned, he never thought to see beyond what he had already decided to believe. "You didn't ask," I replied calmly. And that was the difference. Not knowing isn't always about lack of information. Sometimes it's about lack of attention, lack of curiosity, lack of willingness to see someone for who they actually are instead of who you've always assumed them to be. He nodded slowly, understanding what I meant without needing further explanation. I was wrong, he said after a long pause, about a lot of things. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't expected. I wasn't waiting for that apology. I didn't need it, because over the years, I had already moved past the need for validation from people who never truly saw me. What I had built, my success, my independence, my understanding, it didn't come from their approval. It came from my own decisions, my own discipline, my own patience, and that made it real in a way their recognition never could. This isn't about being right or wrong, I said quietly. It's about understanding what happened and what happens next. He looked at me, unsure of what that meant, but the truth was simple. Life moves forward, not backward. You don't erase the past, you learn from it. Or you don't, and the consequences follow accordingly. When I left that meeting, I didn't feel heavy. I didn't feel emotional. I felt clear, completely clear. Because for the first time, everything was aligned. What I knew, what I had built, what others finally understood. It all made sense now. And more importantly, it didn't depend on anyone else anymore. My future wasn't tied to family expectations. It wasn't limited by their perceptions. It wasn't influenced by their approval. It was mine, entirely. And that realization is more powerful than any inheritance, any property, any financial success. Because true power isn't just about what you own. It's about knowing exactly who you are even when no one else does. And sometimes the greatest advantage you can have is being underestimated long enough to build something undeniable. What happened next didn't unfold all at once. There was no dramatic explosion, no single moment where everything collapsed. Instead, it was slower, more controlled, and far more permanent. Because when consequences finally arrive after years of being delayed, they don't rush. They settle in. They reshape everything. And that's exactly what happened to Marcus. At first, he tried to maintain control of the situation the only way he knew how, through confidence. He told people it was a misunderstanding, that there had been confusion about ownership, that everything would be resolved quickly. And for a brief moment, some people believed him because they always had. But confidence without control doesn't last long, and this time he didn't have control. The systems he had relied on, assumptions, appearances, reputation, were no longer enough, because now the situation wasn't built on perception. It was built on documentation, and documentation doesn't change based on how convincingly you speak. It doesn't bend to personality. It simply exists, quietly, permanently. And as those records began to surface in places Marcus couldn't influence, the narrative started shifting without him. Conversations changed. People who once trusted him became cautious. Professional relationships that were built on his image of success began to feel uncertain. And uncertainty, once introduced, spreads quickly, because people don't like risk. And suddenly, Marcus looked like risk. The lifestyle he had created, expensive, polished, impressive, started to feel fragile. Because it had always depended on something unstable, and now that instability was visible. He reached out to me again, not with anger this time, but with something closer to desperation. "We can fix this," he said. "We can handle this privately." But what he didn't understand was that this was never about fixing something in the moment. It was about the accumulation of choices over time, 5 years of decisions, 5 years of actions taken without hesitation. 5 years of believing there would never be consequences. And consequences, once they begin, don't reverse themselves simply because someone asks them to. Meanwhile, the situation extended beyond him. My family couldn't ignore it anymore. What had once been a simple story, Marcus the successful son, me the quiet, average daughter, had completely reversed. And not gradually. instantly. They were forced to confront something they had never considered before, that their understanding of reality had been wrong, completely wrong. And that realization is difficult for anyone, because it requires not just accepting new information, but also questioning everything you thought you knew. My mother struggled with that more than anyone. She kept trying to bring the situation back to something familiar, something manageable, something emotional. "He made mistakes," she said more than once, as if reducing it to that would make it easier to handle. But this wasn't about a single mistake. It was about patterns. And patterns reveal character. That's what makes them important. That's what makes them undeniable. My father, on the other hand, changed in a different way. He became quieter, more observant, like he was finally seeing things he had ignored for years. And in that silence, there was something new, awareness. Not just of what Marcus had done, but of what he himself had failed to notice. And that awareness carried weight, because once you see something clearly, you can't go back to not seeing it. Marcus's world continued to narrow. The confidence that once defined him was replaced by uncertainty. The control he once held over conversations disappeared, and for the first time in his life, he had to face something he had always avoided: accountability. Not in theory, not in discussion, but in reality. The kind that doesn't depend on how you feel about it. The kind that exists whether you accept it or not. And that shift, that complete reversal of position, is what truly changes a person. Because when you move from being the one in control to being the one answering for your actions, everything you believed about yourself gets tested. And not everyone passes that test. Marcus didn't. Not at first. But eventually, he had no choice but to face it. In the months that followed, everything settled into a new kind of normal. Not the old normal, the one built on assumptions and imbalance, but something different, something real. Marcus faded from the center of everything he once controlled. His presence became smaller, quieter, less certain. And for the first time, he was no longer defining the narrative around him. He was reacting to it, adjusting to it, learning from it whether he wanted to or not. My parents adjusted in their own way too, not immediately, not perfectly, but gradually. Because change like this doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to rebuild understanding, to recognize patterns you once ignored, to see people not as roles you assigned them, but as individuals who exist beyond those roles. And for me, life didn't suddenly become louder or more dramatic. It became simpler, clearer, more focused. Because everything I had spent years building quietly was now fully mine, not just legally, but completely. There were no doubts left. No hidden truths waiting to surface. Everything was out in the open. And that kind of clarity is powerful. I expanded my work, grew my investments, made decisions based on strategy, not validation, because I no longer needed anyone to recognize what I was doing. That need had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by something far more valuable: certainty. The certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you've built and exactly how you built it. And sometimes that's the biggest shift of all. Not the external success, not the financial growth, but the internal understanding that you don't need to prove yourself to anyone who refuses to see you. Because real success isn't about being acknowledged. It's about being undeniable. And when something is undeniable, recognition becomes inevitable, even for those who never believed in it. I still think about that meeting sometimes. The moment my brother claimed everything with complete confidence. The moment everyone agreed without question. The moment I realized just how invisible they still believed I was. And then the moment that followed when everything changed. Not because I argued, not because I proved anything in a dramatic way, but because the truth was already there, waiting to be seen. That's the part most people misunderstand. They think success is about convincing others, about showing them, proving to them, forcing them to understand. But it's not. Real success doesn't require explanation. It reveals itself, quietly, clearly, at the right moment. And when it doesn't just change how others see you. It changes how you see yourself, because you realize something that stays with you long after everything else fades, that the strongest position you can ever be in is the one built without needing anyone's approval, the one created through patience, discipline, and clarity, the one that exists whether people believe in it or not. And sometimes, the greatest move you can make is not reacting when people underestimate you. It's letting them continue believing it while you build something so strong, so complete, and so undeniable that when the truth finally appears, it doesn't just surprise them. It defines you.